Publius Cornelius Scipio, Consul 218 BCE. Publius Scipio is best known as the father of Scipio Africanus and as one of the two brothers who established Rome's foothold in Spain, a first step which would do a great deal to win the Second Punic War and initiate several centuries of Roman rule in the Iberian Peninsula. Scipio's reputation is generally high, and he has benefited over the last 2 millennia from the positive coverage that he received from Polybius and Livy. However, when we look closely at Publius Scipio's record, it becomes readily apparent that most of the achievements of the Scipio brothers actually belong to his elder brother, Scipio Calvus. Further, his family's great wealth, the brilliance of his sons Scipio Africanus and Scipio Asiaticus, and the guiding hand of Scipio Aemilianus, who was Publius's adopted great-grandson, all ensured that Publius Scipio has remained highly regarded. Here, I will demonstrate that while Publius Cornelius Scipio was as brave as any Roman, he completely lacked the military prowess which ran so deep among the other Scipiones during the Middle Republic. Publius Cornelius Scipio was one of the scions of the Scipiones, one of the most renowned patrician clans in Rome. Unlike some patrician clans which had declined over the centuries, the Scipiones were actually at the height of their influence at the time that Publius was born around 260. Publius's grandfather, Lucius Cornelius Scipio Barbatus, had been one of the great heroes of his era, and he had contributed a great deal to Rome's war effort during the late stages of the Samnite Wars. Scipio's father was Lucius Cornelius Scipio, who served as consul but does not seem to have really made a name for himself beyond being a consul and the paterfamilias of the Scipiones. Publius had an older brother named Gnaeus, who was 4 years his senior. It goes almost without saying, or at least it should, that the paterfamilias in their era was Gnaeus, not Publius. Polybius and Livy like to blur the lines a bit, since Publius was the father of Scipio Africanus, but the truth is that it is very apparent, both in politics and in military affairs, that Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio Calvus was the senior of the two brothers, and was the man heading the opposition to Fabius. The two leading families of this era were indeed the Scipiones and the Fabii. As for Publius Scipio, we don't know anything about his life or career prior to 218, however we do know that he had a son in 218, Scipio Africanus, who was already about 16 or 17, and he had another son who would go on to become Scipio Asiaticus. He was maybe 8 or 9 at this time, and he would be of age and serve as a legate before the war was over. In the lead-up to 218, Rome had provoked Hannibal into rejecting its ultimatum by making a dubious claim on the city of Saguntum, and now the two consuls of 218 were prepared to lead their armies into the centers of Punic power. The patrician consul, Scipio, was designated to command in Iberia and conquer Hannibal and the other Barcids, while his plebeian colleague, Tiberius Sempronius Longus, was dispatched to Africa, or at least he was to be dispatched to Africa. The Romans seem to have expected a fairly quick victory in this war. We have to remember that Hannibal was only 26 years old at this time, and while he did have some victories under his belt, those victories were all against Celtiberian tribesmen, whom the Romans did not seem to regard terribly highly. Scipio Calvus, Scipio's older brother, who had served as consul 4 years earlier, was experienced and skilled, and he was to serve as the chief legate in the army going to Iberia. This army had 20,000 infantry and also a reasonably strong detachment of cavalry. So the Scipio brothers were set to lead a fairly sizable force into northeastern Iberia. Rather than marching overland through Gaul, which would give them the seemingly impossible task of crossing the Alps in arms, the Romans under Scipio instead took up ships and moved along the north coast of the Mediterranean. When they stopped at the city of Marseille, which at the time was called Massilia, Scipio received news from the locals that Hannibal had been spotted in Gaul and that he was working to cross the Alps. Scipio assumed that Hannibal's plan was bound to end in disaster and was foolhardy in the extreme. However, he knew also that as consul, it was his duty to make sure that Rome was not taken by surprise, and that he had to deal with Hannibal. After all, Hannibal was the man he was expecting to face in Iberia, so it was not an unreasonable interpretation of his orders to think that he needed to deal with the head of the snake from Iberia. However, Scipio also knew that it was important to establish a foothold in Spain and to strike at the heart of Punic power in the west. So his decision was to send his brother along to conduct a campaign in Iberia with the full army, while he would sail back to Italy, rally other forces under the praetors, and then with this makeshift army encounter whatever fragment or remnant of men that Hannibal was able to get across the Alps. This seems to be a perfectly reasonable expectations based on the assumptions of the day. People at the time thought it was utter insanity to try to cross the Alps, and we'll see that Scipio is pretty surprised that Hannibal's army makes it as intact as it was. This was also one of the key decisions of the war, the decision to allow Scipio Calvus to campaign in Iberia, while Publius Scipio decided to confront Hannibal in Italy. Rather than trying to chase Hannibal across the Alps, an area where Scipio had no more allies than did his Punic opponent, he instead took up ship and went to Etruria. Marching north through friendly territory, he raised up men, and probably called one of the Praetorian armies to his side as well. He then crossed the Po River and entered into the Gallic-dominated north. Ostensibly, this was a part of Roman territory, and his brother had actually helped to conquer this area some 4 years before. It's pretty likely that Publius Scipio was present on this campaign, which also featured Marcus Claudius Marcellus. So he was most likely fairly familiar with the area. Polybius tells us that both Scipio and Hannibal were shocked to see the other when they did, and with the kind of strength that each brought to the fray. Scipio was rather amazed that Hannibal had made it so intact through the Alps, other than some heavy losses among his elephants and some pretty substantial losses in other arms. He still had an intact and powerful field army. Hannibal, for his part, thought that the Romans would not confront him, and he would be able to conquer territory, recruit Gauls, and then fight at his leisure in 217 with a fully operational and recovered army. I have to imagine that part of the reason why Hannibal was supposedly impressed with Scipio is that this might have been when he started to realize just how quickly the Romans were able to produce armies. The Roman Republic had a system where all men were required to serve, and a huge percentage of Romans and their allies had military training. So the Romans could literally do what Pompey threatened to do later and stomp their feet and call up an army. This, of course, would ultimately prove to be Hannibal's undoing, but he did not know this at the time. Hannibal was quite alarmed, as he thought that Scipio would march on to Iberia and then find that the Punic forces there were stronger than he knew. But he was still determined to deal with Scipio, and he gathered his army together and started to seek a battle. One detail I forgot to mention earlier is that prior to marching north of the Po, Scipio had sent word to Rome and also to his colleague Tiberius Sempronius Longus, who was assembling his army in Sicily. Longus decided to abandon his plans to invade Africa and instead took his entire consular army north in order to destroy Hannibal. This was a tremendously important decision for the Romans, as there was no front in Africa until 204. But also, this meant for Hannibal that it was imperative that he fight Scipio as soon as possible. He did not have time to seek out the most favorable position or to try to set up the kind of grand battle that he would later show himself to be capable of at Lake Trasimene, Cannae, etc. When Scipio crossed to the north bank of the Ticinus, the next day the two armies began to skirmish. Of course, as we all now know, the Carthaginians were superior in both light infantry and especially in cavalry. At the Ticinus, this was reflected both in the numbers and in the quality. Nonetheless, this apparently was a fairly spirited fight, and it was supposed to go before a general clash of the infantry. Hannibal was winning, and he gained the decisive advantage when his Numidian cavalry circled around the flanks of the Romans, and this led to a rout. Scipio was badly wounded and had to be dragged off the field by his teenage son, who later became Africanus. And in his muddled state, Scipio decided that it was best to cut his losses and not engage in a general fight, so he retreated back across the Po and took up a post in a fortified city. 600 men in his rear guard were taken prisoner after Hannibal pursued, but Scipio did succeed in saving his makeshift army. A few weeks later, Sempronius Longus arrived. According to Polybius and Livy, who are both very heavily favorable to Scipio and critical of Sempronius Longus, supposedly Longus laughed off Scipio's advice about facing Hannibal and marched headlong into disaster at the Trebia. One thing that's worth noting about the Trebia is, despite the fact that Roman casualties were heavy, you could make the argument that Sempronius Longus actually did a little better than Scipio had, as his men did prevail on one part of the field, and the bulk of his army did escape. So, actually, one thing that I'd like to point out here is that the more I think about it, the more I realize that Hannibal's trifecta of crossing the Alps, then winning Ticinus and the Trebia back-to-back, so defeating the enemy in depth and establishing his foothold in Italy, this might actually be his greatest deed, more so even than the Battle of Cannae. It's hard to say, but what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. After he recovered from his wound, his consulship expired, and he then left for Iberia to join his brother Scipio Calvus. It is not clear if one or both of the brothers was confirmed as a proconsul. Our sources are a little bit vague about this, which makes me think that the proconsul was in fact Calvus and not Publius Scipio. At any rate, by the time that Publius arrived, most of the hard work had already been done. Scipio Calvus had landed and had performed in a fashion similar to what Hannibal had done in North Italy. Although, of course, the local opposition was not nearly so tough. Scipio Calvus began to negotiate with local leaders, setting up alliances, and he defeated a couple of small armies, thus establishing a reasonably strong Roman foothold in the northeast. He also won a naval battle at this time and ensured that for most of the rest of this campaign, the Romans would enjoy naval supremacy. Just from the way that the brothers divided their responsibilities, it is abundantly clear that Scipio Calvus was in overall command, even if both of them were theoretically both proconsuls. He commanded the army, which in Rome was always superior to the navy, and in this case much, much more important since the Carthaginians did not have much of a fleet to speak of in this area, while Publius Scipio typically was stuck commanding the fleet and effectively supplying his brother. A couple years later, after the twin catastrophes at Lake Trasimene and Cannae, the two brothers were faced with more difficult strategic decisions. Now they were in command of a secondary theater which was getting some positive results, but one where they were now operating on the shoestring as Rome was making sure that no more Roman reinforcements were leaving Italy. They were being extremely cautious after suffering two brutal and bloody defeats. This meant that the Scipio brothers had to do something that was a first in Roman history. They were hiring local mercenaries and relying upon them to do their duty. Typically speaking, the Romans were, at this time at least, not terribly trusting when it came to outsiders who were not beholden to them on some deeper level. Indeed, as we'll see, this would come back to bite them in the ass eventually. The most famous battle of the Second Punic War occurred in August of 216 when Hannibal smashed a massive Roman army at Cannae. This battle put Rome at a severe disadvantage and gave Carthage openings that they did not previously enjoy. In 215, Carthage went on the offensive across the board, and there were even plans to send a full army into Italy to reinforce Hannibal in order to finish the war as quickly as possible. This year, the Romans pulled off what can only be described as a miracle on three broad fronts. They managed to win three different battles or campaigns, which effectively halted the momentum of Carthage and undid Hannibal's progress, or at least made it to where the Battle of Cannae was no longer something that had Rome on the ropes. One of the three parts of Rome's success came in the west at Dertosa. The plan by the Carthaginians was for Hasdrubal Barca, who up to this point had been effectively the viceroy of Carthage in Spain, to lead his army out and into Italy. He was going to take 40,000 or more men to reinforce his brother and finish off the war. For obvious reasons, Publius and his brother Scipio Calvus did not want this to happen. In 215, the Romans were still pretty fragile, and the influx of so many men who would then go under the command of an extremely talented general such as Hannibal would very well have decided the war against them. As Hasdrubal was marching north, he was trying to cross the Ebro while evading the Scipiones, but they managed to intercept him near Dertosa, which was also called Iberia. In this battle, Hasdrubal tried and failed to emulate his brother by pulling off a double envelopment. Unlike Hannibal at Cannae, who allowed his center to cave in before moving his flanks forward, Hasdrubal simply tried to do a double flank attack. This maneuver ended up failing as Scipio Calvus foresaw that Hasdrubal would attempt this, and in the aftermath, Hasdrubal's army largely disintegrated. Most of Hasdrubal's men were Celtiberian mercenaries, and many of them decided to simply leave after the defeat. Not only did the two brothers prevent Hasdrubal from leaving Iberia with a substantial army, but they also destroyed the principal army in Iberia, thus creating a crisis of confidence back at Carthage. The Carthaginians had several thousand elite troops they were readying to go to Italy, and instead they sent them to Hasdrubal to form the core of a new army. Carthage was very much concerned with defending Spain because this is where most of their wealth was coming from. The mines of the south were incredibly important to Carthage's overall economy and war effort. Dertosa is, in my opinion at least, easily the most underrated battle of the war. The most underrated campaign would be the campaign of Marcus Valerius Livinus, but if we had to boil it down to just a single battle, it is this one. Even after Dertosa, the Scipiones had to remain cautious as they were not getting much in the way of reinforcements. By 212, however, they felt strong enough to venture into the south. Much of this must have stemmed from their gaining more confidence in the loyalty of the locals. By this point, they had good relations with many of the chiefs of the north, and they felt that their men would stick by them through thick and thin. The two brothers were launching a two-pronged assault deep south of the Ebro, and they were hoping to win a decisive advantage over Hasdrubal and Mago Barca. By all appearances, both brothers were ignorant of what had transpired over the winter of 213-12. That winter, Carthage had sent over two major sources of reinforcements into Iberia. One was an army under Hasdrubal Gisgo, who would go on to be one of Carthage's best generals in the war, and the other force was under a 17-year-old Massinissa of Numidia, fresh off of a victory against the much older and more experienced Syphax, and still looking to prove himself. In the upcoming campaign, he would do just that, and unfortunately, his coming out party would be at the expense of the two Scipiones, both of whom effectively died due to his presence. The younger of the two Scipio brothers would fight the younger of the two Barca brothers. Publius Scipio took 2/3 of the remaining Roman troops and a smaller force of mercenaries, marched through the hinterlands, and tried to confront Mago Barca. However, before he could force a battle with Mago, he realized that he and Mago were not alone in the area. He was then confronted by the newly arrived force of Numidian cavalry under the command of Massinissa. Massinissa was extremely effective, and his men were the best cavalry of this period. Effectively, Scipio was unable to move or forage, and he knew that he was in a bind. he had no choice but to try to retreat. Then a third force appeared on the scene under Indibulus, a chief who had been dogging the Scipio brothers for years. Indibulus had been defeated on many occasions, but he never gave up, just like John Cena. Now he had 7,500 Celtiberians under his command, and he was approaching Scipio's position from the rear. Not surprisingly, Scipio decided that if he had to fight one of these forces to break out, it should be the smallest and weakest under a man who had already proven himself capable of losing. Scipio's decision to strike Indibulus in order to break out was fundamentally sound, and in some ways you could argue that it actually did work. Indibulus was outnumbered and outmatched, but unfortunately for Scipio, his men did not waver, even though they were attacked by heavier numbers and ostensibly superior troops. Indibulus was able to hang on until the other three forces under Mago, Massinissa, and Hasdrubal Gisgo arrived and joined the fray. Scipio himself was killed in action this time, fighting in the front lines just as he had at the Ticinus, but he did not have his son there to help him. Interestingly enough, Scipio Africanus would not arrive in Spain until 211, when he, at the age of 25, would replace his father and uncle. Some portion of Scipio's army, it's unclear exactly how many men were in this unit, did manage to break out under the command of the legate Tiberius Fontius and managed to escape to Roman territory north of the Ebro. Part of the reason why Tiberius Fontius was able to pull off this retreat is because as soon as Scipio's army had been eliminated, the three commanders decided to hustle over and help out Hasdrubal Barca, who was facing off against Scipio Calvus. Hasdrubal, for his part, had the treasury, which he used to bribe the heavy Celtiberian contingent under Scipio Calvus, thus depriving him of most of his men. But before he could begin his retreat, this army arrived from the west. At this point, Scipio Calvus did not know where his brother was, and he began to retreat northwards. Of course, just as had been the case with Publius Scipio, Scipio Calvus had no way to counter the Numidians, and ultimately they dogged his every step until the main army overtook and destroyed him. You could argue that Scipio's defeat doomed his brother, which I think is accurate, but that should not in any way diminish the bravery that Publius Scipio showed at his final stand. Scipio Calvus, for his part, also fought very bravely, but the two brothers' armies were wiped out. As we know, enough men survived that the Romans were able to rebuild due to the surviving legates, the praetor Claudius Nero, and ultimately a young Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus who took up the mantle of his father and uncle. However, this was a close-run thing, and for a while it looked like the defeat of the Scipiones was something which would doom Rome, or at the least shift the balance of power in Carthage's favor. Despite lacking a signal achievement, Publius Cornelius Scipio is still one of the more important figures of the Second Punic War. Even when we discount the exaggeration of Polybius about his contributions, the fact remains that his decision to send his brother ahead to establish a foothold in Iberia ended up having huge ramifications for the outcome of the war. Without Rome's foothold north of the Ebro, the Carthaginians would have been free to continue to pump reinforcements into Italy, especially after Sempronius Longus decided to not send his army to Africa. This would have given Hannibal the initiative and put him at the head of all Carthage's armies in Italy. As for the Battle of Dertosa, where Publius Scipio was the second in command, this was one of the key moments in breaking Punic momentum in 215. It is safe to assume, based on his performance at the Ticinus and later against Mago and crew, that Publius Scipio was not exactly a very good field commander. However, we can tell from all of his other performances that he was at least minimally competent, and that he also fought bravely and in the front lines. Roman Spain, which he helped to create, even if it is more his brother's creation than his own, did prove to be durable, and it proved to be a decisive theater of the war. His son would take over this command after his death, and go on to complete what the Scipiones had started. This would cut off Hannibal's sources of money, and ultimately allow for a Roman invasion of Africa. Militarily, Publius Scipio was rather limited despite being the father of arguably the greatest general that Rome produced over the course of its entire history. This goes to show that genetics are not everything. If anything, Scipio Africanus, that is, seems to have inherited his military abilities from his uncle and from his grandfather, Scipio Barbatus, or great-grandfather in the case of Africanus. Ultimately, the fame of Scipio Africanus and Scipio Asiaticus really bolstered Scipio's reputation posthumously and made him appear to be much more equal to his brother Scipio Calvus than he actually was. It says a lot that even though Scipio Calvus' son was extremely accomplished, he decided to create a new cognomen in order to distinguish himself from his more famous cousins. Scipio Nasica was a great man in his own right. He served as consul, and he was a famous jurist. However, he simply could not compete in terms of prestige with his cousin, Scipio fucking Africanus. And due to the influence of the sons of Publius, and especially the efforts of his adopted great-grandson Scipio Aemilianus, who took on Polybius as his political prisoner/tutor, history has been very, very kind to the elder Scipio. I would argue too kind when it comes to his contributions, although, as I said, there were some real contributions, namely the decision to allow Scipio Calvus to proceed. Until next time, I'm Thersites the Historian, and when I return, we'll be looking at more generals of the Second Punic War. Peace out.